What happens when an aging lion, once a mighty ruler, is left to die in solitude after losing a brutal battle for power? Follow his journey of suffering, rescue, and fragile trust as two park rangers offer him the chance to find peace in his final days. Under the scorching sun of Kruger National Park, an old lion walked slowly across the parched grasslands. Once the proud king of a mighty pride, he was now a mere shadow of his former self. His golden brown mane, once thick and regal, had thinned and faded. His teeth were worn down to nubs, barely able to pierce the flesh of his prey. His eyes were sunken, giving him an exhausted look as he staggered forward with each labored step. The strong, proud lion who had once ruled his domain with power and confidence was now reduced to a broken figure, wandering alone in a land that had once been his kingdom. Time had been cruel to him. The younger, stronger lions had taken over the pride, pushing him aside, forcing him into isolation. He no longer had the strength to hunt or protect his territory. His ribs were visible beneath his rough, weathered skin, and some were beginning to ulcerate. The once majestic predator was now weak, his every step a struggle. His body trembled with exhaustion as he searched for food and water, but his attempts to hunt were futile. His teeth had become so brittle that he could no longer sink them into the flesh of antelopes. The battle for survival was no longer one he could win. But the old lion's troubles didn't end there. A challenge was brewing, one that would force him to confront the brutal reality of his age and weakness. The young lion, a strong and determined challenger, had emerged as a new contender for the throne. His sleek, powerful body rippled with strength, his eyes filled with ambition. The pride could not be led by an old, ailing lion, and the young lion was determined to claim what he believed was rightfully his. One day, the challenge came. The two lions faced each other on the wide, dusty plains. The young lion roared with all the ferocity of his youth, muscles coiled with tension, ready to pounce. The old lion, despite his frailty, stood his ground, his eyes narrowing as he prepared for the battle. This was no ordinary fight. It was a fight for dominance, a fight for the very throne of the pride. With a roar, the young lion lunged first, aiming for the old lion's throat. His teeth bared, claws extended. But the elder lion, though slow, reacted with surprising agility, sidestepping the attack. His old muscles creaked in protest, but he managed to land a blow on the young lion's side, his claws scraping deep into the flesh. The young lion staggered back, wounded but far from defeated. Without hesitation, the younger lion charged again, fury flashing in his eyes. His strength and speed were unmatched, and he struck with relentless force. The elder lion struggled to block the blows, his old body beginning to betray him as the young lion's claws tore into his skin. Blood stained the earth beneath them, but the old lion refused to fall. With a great effort, he swiped at the younger lion's face, managing to score a shallow cut across the young challenger's muzzle. But the young lion was quick. He recovered instantly, and, with a vicious swipe, landed a crushing blow to the old lion's flank. The elder's legs buckled, and he collapsed. The wind knocked from his chest. He tried to rise, but his strength was failing him. The young lion pressed forward, claws sinking deep into the older lion's shoulder. The old lion growled in pain, but he knew the battle was lost. He was no longer the powerful king he had once been. The younger lion's strength had overpowered him. With one final pitiful roar, the old lion lay motionless, breathing heavily, accepting his defeat. The young lion stood above him, victorious, his chest heaving as he looked down at his fallen opponent. The pride now had a new leader. The battle for the throne was over, and the old lion, once the mighty ruler, had been dethroned. The young lion walked away, his head held high as the new king of the pride. The old lion, defeated and bloodied, limped off into the savannah, his once proud body now a shadow of its former glory. but the land was harsh, and survival in the wild would no longer be kind to him. He was now alone, his place in the pride lost, his reign over the grasslands forgotten. The old lion, though defeated, did not give up easily. For days, he wandered alone through the harsh, dry savannah, each step heavier than the last. The once thriving pride he had led with strength and wisdom was now a distant memory, and the land, too, seemed to turn its back on him. His body, battered and bruised from the battle with the young lion, grew weaker with each passing day. His ribs were clearly visible beneath his thin, cracked skin, and his steps became more staggered as the days wore on. Hunger and thirst plagued him as he searched in vain for food and water. The shallow pools he stumbled upon were dry or had little moisture left, and his attempts to hunt were futile. The old lion was no longer the king of the savannah. He had been ousted, and now he was left to face the brutal reality of the natural world, one where only the strong survive, and the weak are abandoned to fend for themselves. His body ached from the wounds he had sustained in his battle, and his pride was gone. He was a king no longer, just another casualty of the unforgiving wild. As he moved through the sparse trees and dry grass, he could hear the distant roars of the new ruler, the young lion who had claimed the throne. The sounds were a stark reminder of his defeat. The old lion felt the weight of his failure, but he knew deep down that there was nothing he could do now. He was too old, too weak, and the battle for dominance was long over. One afternoon, as the sun beat down mercilessly, the old lion found a small patch of shade beneath a lone tree. He collapsed there, exhausted, his body trembling with fatigue. The heat of the day seemed to drain the last bit of strength he had, and he closed his eyes, letting the world slip away for a brief moment of rest. But his relief was short-lived. A sharp, searing pain coursed through his body as he shifted to find a more comfortable position. He had been injured, and his wounds had festered. The old lion groaned, his breath shallow and ragged. It was then that Ethan and Nora, two park rangers who had been monitoring the area, heard the faint sound of a weak roar. At first, they thought it was just the wind or the cry of another animal. But as they listened more closely, they realized it was the unmistakable call of a lion in distress. They exchanged a glance, their faces etched with concern. The news of the old lion's condition had spread among the staff, and they knew they had to act quickly if there was any hope of saving him. Armed with medical supplies, a tranquilizer gun, and some fresh meat, Ethan and Nora set out to find the old lion. The park was vast, and it took them hours to track his movements, following the faint footprints and signs of his presence. They knew the dangers of approaching a wild lion, especially one that might be in pain or frightened, but the sight of the old lion's deteriorating condition spurred them on. When they finally found him, he was sitting under the tree, barely able to lift his head. His body was thin, his fur matted with blood and dirt. The rangers stopped a safe distance away, observing him carefully. Nora raised her tranquilizer gun, but Ethan hesitated. The lion was in no state to fight back, and they could see the deep exhaustion in his eyes. They knew that if they didn't act soon, the lion wouldn't survive much longer. "We need to get him back to the care facility," Ethan said quietly, his voice tinged with sadness. "He doesn't have much time." Nora nodded, her heart heavy with compassion. "Let's approach slowly and try not to startle him." They began to move closer, cautiously, making sure to avoid sudden movements. The old lion blinked weakly, squinting at the two figures approaching him. He didn't make a sound, but his eyes seemed to recognize the kindness in their gaze. Nora spoke softly, trying to calm him, while Ethan carefully held out a piece of fresh meat. The smell of the meat seemed to trigger the lion's survival instincts, and he reached out with what little strength he had left to take the food. His jaws were weak, but the desire to eat was too strong to ignore. As he chewed, his breathing became a little steadier, and for the first time in days, there was a small glimmer of trust in his eyes. Seeing that the old lion was willing to eat, the rangers knew they had a chance. Ethan moved even closer, gently administering a health-boosting injection to help the lion regain a bit of strength. As the lion ate, Nora prepared the transport cage, carefully placing it a few meters away. The old lion, still shaky but now a bit more alert, seemed to understand. He stood up with great effort, his legs trembling, but he made his way toward the cage. Each step was a battle, but the promise of safety and care seemed to guide him. With one final push, the lion crawled into the cage and the rangers closed the door behind him. There was no struggle, just a quiet surrender to the help that had come. They quickly loaded the cage onto the truck, taking extra care to avoid jarring movements. As they began the journey back to the park's veterinary center, the old lion lay on the straw inside the cage, exhausted but no longer alone. When they reached the facility, the staff was ready. The lion was carefully transferred into a special enclosure, lined with soft straw. The vets began their examination, treating his malnutrition and wounds, administering painkillers, and confirming that his teeth were no longer functional. Ethan and Nora watched, heartbroken by his condition, but relieved that he was now in safe hands. The Kruger National Park Animal Care Center provided a peaceful space where the lion could rest, no longer needing to hunt or worry about predators. Every day, the staff attended to him, changing bandages and feeding him soft meals to aid his recovery. Over the weeks, the lion gained a little weight and his fur became smoother, though he would never regain his former glory. Ethan and Nora visited regularly, offering gentle words and observing his progress. Slowly, he grew more accustomed to their presence and, at times, nuzzled their hands in fragile trust. While he would never return to his kingdom, the lion found peace in his final days. He was no longer alone, surrounded by the care and compassion of the people who had given him one last chance at life. The king of the savannah, now a symbol of vulnerability and resilience, lived out his remaining days in comfort, no longer abandoned, but cared for in his final journey.